Hey guys, so this is a response to a recent video by Vegan Gains. He's talking about Matt Dillahunty, who is on the Atheist Experience. It's like a call-in show. So on this one episode, I guess you would call it, a vegan called in and wanted to talk about veganism on the show. Matt has defended eating meat in the past, and he defends it again here in this video, in this discussion. Unfortunately, Vegan Gains' response to this is not great.
About a vegan diet and the morality of eating a vegan diet versus a meat diet.
Okay, I don't know what that has to do with atheism.
Even though Matt is trying to keep a cool face, I can tell he's very uncomfortable discussing this topic, and his first argument is essentially, what does this have to do with anything? Trying to undermine the importance of a very serious ethical issue.
Well, I mean, it is called the Atheist Experience. A viewer would expect for the topics being discussed to be relevant to atheism, right? I mean, it would be really weird if Matt and the other host just randomly started talking about knitting or something. It would be pretty hard to retain an audience. The person who called in wanting to talk about veganism fumbled a little bit in answering how this was relevant to atheism. And honestly, Richard, Vegan Gains' response is not much better. They almost got it, but the problem is that they really needed to get it right, because this is the crux of the whole issue. This is what makes or breaks the argument for Dillahunty's hypocrisy.
To answer your question, Matt, what does veganism have to do with atheism? Well, I don't think the two topics are directly related.
To atheism generally? No, it's not directly related, because atheism is not a moral stance. It's just you don't believe in God. You can be an amoral nihilist atheist. But to Matt Dillahunty's brand of atheism, to the Atheist Experience brand of atheism, it is absolutely directly related. Matt has made a career arguing for secular moral value, for objective secular morality.
Since you've been an atheist, here's my question. Do universal objective moral values exist?
I believe they do.
I happen to think that we can have objective moral values.
There are scientific truths to be learned about morality, which is in part the case that Sam Harris is making. And it's part of what I'm saying, that if you think about it, in any particular situation, there are a number of possible actions. And some of them are better and some of them are worse, which means out of the pool, the finite pool of actions for this particular situation, there is a set, it may be a set of one, it may be a set of 50,000, that represent the pinnacle, best moral action for that scenario. In that situation, that is objective.
Criticizing non-theistic morality is a common argument from leading Christian apologists, and it's their strongest argument by far. The argument basically is that we cannot have morality without God, that without some sort of objective lawgiver, that any sort of human morality breaks down into mere subjective human opinion. If this is true, if the apologists are right, of course, it doesn't mean that God actually exists, but it does mean that the new atheists are no better than theists who use faith as an excuse to base moral values on personal intuition. If Matt's dismissal of veganism relies on his claim that he draws an arbitrary moral line at species, and it does, then his position on secular ethics is demolished. It's reduced to a subjective appeal to arbitrary personal whim, meaning that the Christian apologists are right about atheists, or at least about Dillahunty-style atheists. Point is, I think that explanation and discussion of this should have made up the bulk of Richard's response. Matt does have the burden of proof here, because he's trying to have his morality and his subjectivism too. He's been a vocal advocate of secular ethics, and as I showed before with those clips, he's argued that it can be objective. But unless you make the conversation about that specifically and challenge those arbitrary lines Matt is drawing, and you do that on the grounds of other positions he's advocated, there's really no foothold here. Matt was very careful to avoid taking on the burden of proof by saying that veganism is wrong. He doesn't say that at all. What he does say is that he's not convinced.
So the thing about morality...
That doesn't mean you're right, exactly, I don't think.
Okay, it doesn't mean I'm wrong either. Congratulations, we're at an impasse. Saying it doesn't mean I'm right. I'm telling you what my views on morality are,
That's where Matt draws the line. You draw the line in
a different place.
Spot.
And you have to make a compelling case for why I should change my mind and draw the line there. Even if you're correct, and my speciesism is as wrong as the racism that allowed for slavery, you have to actually make a case for why that is. This is not a resolved issue, and I'm not claiming that I'm right. I just have not been convinced. These conversations get roadblocked because I have a particular view of morality, and when what needs to happen is somebody needs to show me why that's wrong. But I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm saying I remain unconvinced in much the same way that I don't say, generally, there's no such thing as God.
If the caller didn't come prepared to talk about how veganism is relevant to the atheist experience, to Matt Dillahunty, style atheism, and either come with his own proof or show how Matt had the burden of proof, then he really didn't come prepared to argue for veganism in any sort of relevant context to the show. Calling out somebody because they eat meat, just seemingly randomly in some random place and time, it just comes across as preachy and obnoxious. Again, it is absolutely appropriate to call in to the atheist experience and talk about veganism, but really only if you are willing to talk about their so-called objective morality and show how it breaks down when they start drawing these arbitrary lines that exclude consideration for sentient non-human animals. You have to focus on the claims that they've made and show how those are inconsistent with the speciesism that they've accepted. Unfortunately, the caller did not do this, and Richard doesn't do it either.
But they are both moral issues. The whole reason you discuss atheism in the first place is because you think honesty and the truth are moral imperatives.
Just because somebody holds one subjective moral imperative doesn't mean that they'll care about other moral imperatives that they don't hold. The key here is Matt's claim of objective morality. I'm not surprised that Richard misses this, considering that he has identified as a moral subjectivist.
Morality to me is subjective, but I think it is a useful trait that we evolved to have.
Vegan Gains buys into the false dichotomy presented by apologists and then makes an appeal to nature fallacy, equating morality with evolved social empathy and calling it useful. And he does the same thing in response to Matt.
The idea that about compassion and not killing animals that want to live, more or less,
why should I care? Why should I care if they want to live?
It's a terrible response, completely devoid of compassion, empathy. It's unlikely to endear many people to Dillahunty or his style of atheism. But unfortunately, Richard's response, which amounts to nearly 5 minutes of assertions and appeal to nature, just isn't a compelling argument against it.
Why should I care if you want to live, Matt? Maybe it's because you're a sentient being that can experience pain and suffering and has a will to live. There's this thing called empathy, which is the basis for morality, and it's present in all social animals. Recent rodent experiments have proven that rats have the ability to feel empathy, and they will save fellow rats from drowning, even when there is a reward incentive in place to not save their fellow rat.
We also evolved to love the taste of sugary, fatty, salty foods because they were very useful in our evolution. And of course, this resulted in us creating super hyper palatable foods that we can't stop eating, even to the point of extreme obesity and sickness. What was evolutionarily useful at one point can become harmful at another. In other words, just because we evolved something doesn't mean that it's inherently good. Why is empathy important? If Richard's argument is because it's useful, then it's not really the empathy that's important, it's the effect of the empathy. Let's say that the evolutionary purpose was to enable society. Is it really useful for modern human society to empathize with animals? And if it is, why are we compelled to follow evolution's goals as if it's some moral giving deity? Or maybe Richard's argument for empathy is because it's natural. Well, what about someone who just naturally doesn't have empathy? Or someone who naturally doesn't have empathy for animals, for non-human animals? what is compelling them to behave as though they do? Trying to argue for veganism from a subjective standpoint, from the standpoint that morality is subjective, as Richard is doing, just doesn't work. And it only gets worse from here.
Let's say there's a kid standing out in the road and there's a bus coming, and you have the opportunity to rescue that kid without putting yourself at risk at all. You can make a good argument that you have a moral obligation to rescue that kid because there's zero risk, everything else. If the bus is really close and you would be putting yourself at risk, it would be morally virtuous of you to rescue that kid, but you're not necessarily under an obligation anymore. You're under a moral obligation to not run around killing people, but you're not under a moral obligation to never tell a lie, although that might in fact be virtuous.
Matt doesn't really seem to understand what he's actually saying, and his arguments become more and more incoherent as this video goes on. So what Matt is describing here is social contract. Social contracts are implicit agreements among members of a society which dictate social conduct for the overall benefit of a society. What Matt is saying here is that he is under no obligation under our current social contract to not kill and eat animals.
Not once did Dillahunty mention social contract or anything that resembles social contract theory. The only thing Matt said that comes close is his statement later in the video saying that moral agents have moral value. He's trying to find something special about humans to justify the species line.
From my view, moral responsibility is tied to a capacity to understand the consequences of one's actions. And we draw lines along species. We draw lines along species for very good reason. Because let's say there's someone, a young boy, for example, I had somebody in my family who's basically born with no cognitive abilities at all. Okay? He's still a human being. And the reason that we include that individual, even though they are not a thinking being at all, a human born with no cognitive abilities, they can't possibly assess their actions, they are under no moral evaluation. They have no moral reasoning. But we treat them within this category of humans because there are other people who care about that kid. Okay?
Right.
And so it would be wrong of me to kill that kid, even though he's brain dead, because of its impact on those other people who are moral reasoners and moral actors.
Right.
This is not an equitable arrangement when we start crossing the boundaries of species. Now, are there some species that I would put on, the side of the line for moral evaluation such that they would be on the side of, do not eat? Sure.
So what Matt's talking about here is questions of personal responsibility. He's dividing morally relevant actions into virtues and obligations in order to excuse himself the responsibility of being a better person when he finds it inconvenient. Now, there is something to be said for the amount of risk and effort that you put into something versus the payoff in terms of harm reduction and the good that comes out of it. We want to be effective. We want to get the most out of our altruistic efforts. But when it comes to veganism, any sensible evaluation of effort and risk versus payoff definitely does not help Matt's case. Veganism is very doable for most people living in the developed world, and it's even easy if you take a gradual approach, transitioning over a number of months or even years, and it has the largest payoff in ethical terms of any lifestyle change that you could make. There may be certain people who can't do it for various reasons under various circumstances, but that doesn't excuse the people who can't do it from the obligation. And transitioning to a vegan diet obviously does not put you at risk in the way that stepping in front of a car does. Veganism does not need to be nutritionally superior, it only needs to be equal or at least not so dangerous as to put our lives at risk. This isn't an oncoming truck. It's changing habits and it's a bit of a learning curve. Something that should be super trivial and super easy for someone as intelligent as Matt. Someone who wouldn't be persuaded by the shitty vegan diets like Fully Raw and Raw Till 4 and Starch Solution.
Matt has created a double standard here. He uses empathy as the basis for his moral outlook. He recognizes that social contract is not a basis for morality, yet he deploys social contract as an excuse to needlessly kill animals because that's the best argument he can come up with on the spot to defend his poor lifestyle choices.
Matt clearly does not base his morality on empathy. He bases it on what he believes is a rationally constructed objective morality. The problem is not that Matt is ignoring empathy. The problem is that he's drawing arbitrary distinctions when it suits him, and as a result, undermining his position on objective morality. It's really unfortunate that Richard is convinced that this all has to do with empathy, because it results in him completely misunderstanding Dillahunty's argument, which then results in him not being able to counter it effectively.
So Matt's video goes on for another 14 minutes, but there's no sense in responding to the rest. He just repeats the same assertions and logical fallacies.
That's actually not true. Matt goes on to clarify some of the things that he said earlier in the video, and clarifies them in such a way that it makes it very hard to interpret them in the way that Vegan Gains has interpreted them. Matt also brings up the issue of vegans buying things that they don't need that are presumably harmful, something that has become a sort of Achilles heel for Richard. Matt isn't making an appeal to futility fallacy, he's making a tu quoque fallacy in order to justify his own arbitrary lines by trying to show that vegans are drawing arbitrary lines too, just at a different place. He tried to do that with insects and deaths in agriculture and failed because the caller agreed that it was wrong to kill insects and that we should improve agriculture. Then he tried again with technology when he brought up the caller's cell phone and talked about how humans don't need cell phones.
So first of all, if you're just going to base it on need, get rid of your phone. You don't need it.
I do need it.
No, you don't. Humans,
Yeah,
humans survived.
I need for jobs.
Humans survived for millions of years without any sort of cell phone.
The caller didn't have a good response to that, and neither has Vegan Gains when he's been challenged on that in debates. His trademark mishmash of moral subjectivism and appeal to nature, along with his personal arbitrary lines that just so happen to establish veganism as the moral baseline, doesn't really work, and ultimately makes him a really bad person to argue against someone like Dillahunty, because they're both doing the same thing. They're both ultimately arguing for morality based on personal whim. Look, I don't agree with Dillahunty either. We can't substantiate moral objectivism and then arbitrarily ignore or follow it at our leisure. Any behavior that causes harm is an issue, and we should strive to do better. And not all vegans draw arbitrary lines to consider veganism the moral baseline and then dismiss the notion that they might do more to reduce further harm. But even if they did, it still wouldn't excuse Dillahunty doing the same, just with a different set of arbitrary lines. Point is, tu quoque is not an excuse for moral subjectivism. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Comments and questions down below. If you want to subscribe, that's awesome. And if you want to support the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/unnaturalvegan.